You're listening to the Braver Angels podcast, a new way of talking politics. I'm your host, John Wood Jr. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we are back on the Braver Angels podcast, and I am very pleased and delighted to be joined by a very special guest today. Today's guest is Professor Carol Swain. Carol is an accomplished academic. She's the author of two notable books, including Black Faces and Black Interests and The New White Nationalism. We're going to get the opportunity to talk a little bit today about race, about religion, about politics, Donald Trump, basically the whole menu of things you're not allowed to talk about at the dinner table, I take it. And I couldn't imagine a better conversation partner for those topics. Carol, how are you doing today?
I'm doing fine, but you missed two of my other books that I think are notable.
Uh-oh.
And the reason why the secular world might not notice those books is that they were written for the general public. And one is Be the People, A Call to Reclaim America's Faith and Promise, that was published by Thomas Nelson in 2011. And another more recent one is Abduction, How Liberalism Steals the Hearts and Minds of Our Children. And so you can imagine why that only plays well with certain audiences.
Right, gotcha. Okay, well, I can't imagine that, but I'm glad that you offered the correction. And Carol, you are the founder, you're the host of the Be the People podcast and the founder of BeThePeopleNews.com. Am I correct in that?
Yes, and I have a 501c3 called Be the People Project. And so I'm very busy since I left academia in 2017. I took early retirement for a variety of reasons, and I've never looked back, even though I miss teaching young people. I love young people, and the only access I have now mostly is when I get invited to speak for Young America's Foundation. Sometimes I get college campus invitations, and I have 4 PragerU videos that have been viewed by over 40 million people. And so when I travel, I run into young people all the time that have seen one of those videos.
Right. And of course, I've known your name for some time. I think that I didn't start to take a particular I didn't start to look into you more deeply until I had seen one of the PragerU videos. And of course, you and I now are connected through our mutual friend, Bob Woodson, Lynn Lowry, and some of our associates over at the 1776 Unites project. And so for all sorts of reasons, it's just very exciting to be able to have you here. You've already alluded to it. Your identity as a Christian, a Black conservative, I think has had some bearing in terms of some of the doors you're able to step into in your academic and in your public life. I want to talk about that because at Braver Angels, we are the largest grassroots bipartisan organization in America dedicated to the work of political depolarization. We try to open up the avenues for good faith conversation and dialogue, not close them down, right? So that's something I want to talk to you about. But first, the thing that makes you so unique and so, I think, interesting to so many people is the fact that you have an American story as an African-American woman and just as an American that is a remarkable sort of tribute to the ability of people, in this country to overcome very difficult circumstances and to make the most of themselves. I know you're used to telling your story quite a bit, but I'm wondering if before we jump into the other juicier stuff, if you wouldn't mind just taking a minute to tell us who Carol Swain is and moreover, where she comes from.
I can tell you what Carol Swain has experienced. I was born in 1954. That was the year of the Brown versus Board of Education Supreme Court decision that ordered schools desegregated across the South. And even though that decision came down in 1954, my school did not integrate until 1968 or 1969. So I experienced the segregated South, which means that I lived at a time when there really was systemic racism. And I watched the passage of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, the 1965 Voting Rights Act, the 1968 Open Housing Act, the Immigration Reform Act that also took place in 1965. And so to hear people today complain about America, they really don't know systemic racism. Systemic racism was what existed, in my childhood and before my childhood. And what I've watched is doors open. And as for myself, born in 1954, I was one of 12 children who grew up in rural Southern poverty. And there's a difference between rural poverty and urban poverty, because with rural poverty, you're really out in the sticks. For the early part of my life, I lived in a 2-room shack without indoor plumbing. I can remember times that when it snowed heavily, me and my siblings all stayed home from school until the snow melted because we did not have proper shoes to go to school. One year we missed 108, excuse me, that year, one year we missed 80 of 180 school days, and everyone in the household failed. I'm married at 16, had my first child at 17, and by the time I was 20, I had 3 small children. And the one thing I can tell you is that even though my siblings and I missed a lot of school, it was true of my elder sister and me that we could miss school, show up, and still make an A or a B. And even though I'm not conscious of my mother or my grandparents or anyone sitting down teaching us, we were able to do really well under those circumstances. And the one area, though, where I've always struggled is math. But I got married at 16, had my first child at 17. By the time I was 20 or so, I was going through a lot of struggles, but I ended up getting a high school equivalency. I went to a community college and got the first of 5 degrees. I have a degree in business, 1 in criminal justice, 2 in political science, and 1 in law. And I have a degree from every type of school: community college, a private liberal arts school, 2 big state universities, and Yale University, an Ivy League school. And so I think that makes me an expert on education.
I would imagine so. And so, obviously, given the contrast between all of your accomplishments, your incredible sort of resume in academia, and the humble beginnings that you just articulated, I mean, it's hard not to be very impressed by that story. Were there certain mentors that kind of guided you to that place, or who allowed you to kind of believe in your ability to succeed at that level? Because I think that for a lot of folks, whether coming from urban or rural poverty, I imagine you must have many people who are limited in terms of what they believe is possible for themselves by virtue of the fact that they don't see people in their own lives succeeding on that level. And so, were there some folks who opened that kind of conviction for you?
Well, today I would tell you that my mother was a factor. If you had spoken to me 5 or 10 years ago, and I would not have mentioned my mother. And I can tell you that I didn't grow up in a family where we were poor and rich in love. My mother was alcoholic, and the stepfather was very abusive. And so it was not, the kind of depiction of the family that you saw on TV in the 1950s. But my mother did not raise her children to see themselves as victims. And even though we qualified for free lunch and free books and free everything, she would not sign us up for anything that was free. She had that Protestant work ethic where we didn't take handouts. And so even though I was growing up in that kind of situation, I never saw myself as handicapped, but I also did not think college was a possibility. And the reason I never thought college was a possibility is that no one in my immediate family was college educated. I did not have college people around me, but I also thought falsely that you had to be rich to go to college. And even though that was not true, that's what I believed. And it was while I was at the community college, and you asked, well, how did I get to the community college? There were 2 people that changed my life. One was a medical doctor. And in my late teens, early 20s, I used to take bottles of pills. I mean, I'd just go to the medicine cabinet, or I'd take a bottle of aspirins, and I would just stormed down.
Mm.
And I really probably, should have died, but I didn't because um, and that was not God's plan for my life. But during one of those episodes, I was in the hospital, and a medical doctor that I'm connected with now told me that I was intelligent, I was attractive, I could do more with my life. And I was sort of stunned because I grew up feeling that I was, that I was ugly. I knew that I was smart because I did well in school when I was in school. So I knew that, but I had forgotten that. He reminded me that, that I was intelligent. I had never at that point had anyone tell me that I was attractive.
Mm.
And so that was new for me. And then there was an African orderly from Sierra Leone that was at one of the nursing homes that I attended. Uh, excuse me, I didn't attend the nursing home, I worked there.
Mm. Right, right.
He told me that I should go to college, that there were a lot of people in college who were not as smart as I was. And so those two people changed my life, the orderly and the medical doctor. And I can tell you that about 3 years ago, I finally got up enough nerves to track down that doctor. And it turns out that he was 25 when I was 20. So he was finishing his residency. And this was in Roanoke, Virginia. And it was the last place he wanted to go. And he had not heard from me all these years. He didn't know what happened to me. But he told me that he did remember me, that every time he visited Roanoke, a place where he came to love the Roanoke Valley, he always wondered what happened to me. And he remembered conversations that we had that I had forgotten. In fact, I had hoped he had forgotten me because I was so messed up, but he hadn't. And we have renewed our acquaintance, and I visited him in Ohio with his wife, and they are part of my life now. And he was someone that was not on the internet. He was working all the time. He never saw me on Fox News. He did not know what happened to me. And so it was just stunning to him that his words had changed my life because it was a factor in my deciding to get my high school equivalency. So so that was one story. And with the African orderly, when I took my job at Princeton, somewhere along the way, I reconnected with him. So he knew that I didn't just go to that community college, but I kept going with my education. So those people encouraged me. But I had a lot of mentors along the way that were professors. One of them was a Black English teacher named Constance J. Hamler. And she impacted my life to the point that at Roanoke College, when I learned that no Blacks had contributed money to Roanoke College and that some of the scholarships had restrictions, I approached her husband and he started a scholarship in her name. Many people in the community contributed to it, and it's an endowed scholarship now, and it supports 8 to 10 students a year. And by support, maybe they get $2,000 or $3,000. They don't get the whole tuition paid, but it's something that I initiated as a senior that's still there. And before Mr. Hamler died, he told me that his wife, Connie, had always wanted to teach at Roanoke College because she was Black. They would not hire her, and how she would feel knowing that there was a scholarship there endowed in her name. And so that's part of my story. And many of my mentors were white. And I would always believe that if I worked hard enough, that I could overcome the circumstances of my birth. I believed in the American dream, and I was able to accomplish that. And I believe that America is a land of tremendous opportunities. And so I'm dismayed when I see what's taking place in America today and the negative messages we're sending young people about systemic racism and white privilege and how all the things they can't do, when I believe that there's never been a better time to be alive and to be Black in America. There's so many opportunities, but we're losing it all. We're losing it because we're destroying relationships with the riots that are taking place that are not peaceful protests about legitimate issues, but now they're riots.
So let me remark on let's get into that. Let me remark on two ironies. Well, the first irony is the fact that it took somebody that long to remark upon you uh, uh, being attractive. It's so funny to me that you would say that because I've been in rooms with you a few different times, and I can say for the audience and anybody who is listening and can't see us right now, Carol Swain is always the best dressed person in any room that she walks into, at least in the rooms that you and I have shared on any occasion. So the idea that that wasn't always the case is funny to me, and maybe that's part of why, right? Maybe after that moment, you sort of flowered into the very stylish person that you're sort of known as today. So that's just an
I don't
interesting
know,
sort of
but I can
aside.
tell you this. When I was at the community college, I did not dress like a student.
Mm.
And I just naturally dressed up for class. And I realize now that I looked more like a teacher or a professor or professional. And no one told me to do that.
Mm.
I probably looked out of place,
Right.
but that was just something natural. And as far as being told I was attractive, my siblings called me Fish Eyes and Frankenstein because I have
Mm.
a scar on my forehead. And so I grew up, being teased by my siblings about my looks. And so I was kind of shocked when the world had a different opinion.
Well, that is interesting. There's a saying that says that clothes make it the man, but I think maybe it applies to the woman too. And so, in any event, but the second irony is that okay, so you made some statements about systemic racism. You said that you grew up, you were born in 1954, the year of Brown versus Board of Education, went through
I
and can
finished.
remember the changes of the civil rights movement and so forth. You say that you remember a time when systemic racism was a real thing, obviously suggesting that we're making too much of this
Yes.
issue today. But what I think is ironic is that in listening to you tell your story, although please correct me if I'm wrong, I don't hear much in your recounting of your personal story to suggest that you ever looked at race as being sort of a significant factor in your own kind of experience. And so clearly you dealt with poverty. Clearly you dealt with a number of circumstances which defeat many of us. Was race kind of in your thinking when you were growing up in the 50s and 60s? I mean, did it ever seem to be something that impacted you in any significant way?
I mean, I was certainly aware of the civil rights movement and things that were taking place in the country, the assassination of John F. Kennedy and Martin Luther King Jr.
Mm-hmm.
But what I saw was opportunities opening up for Blacks. And I believe, to the extent that I may have been disadvantaged because of my race, that I've been advantaged, excuse me, that I've been advantaged even more. And the reason I say that is Ronald College. I graduated magna cum laude while working 40 hours a week at the community college library at a job that was essentially created for me, nights and weekends. And it was created because I was a hard worker.
Mm.
And I believe that as a bright Black student at a school that was predominantly white, it advantaged me because everyone knew my name.
Mm-hmm.
If I had been another student that was white, I would have been just another bright white kid. But because I guess of the stereotypes, my achievements got more recognition than if I had been a person who was Caucasian.
Right. Yeah. And so in your case, there were certain advantages that came with perhaps being African American
The
in that
combination
context.
of define the stereotypes, and it wasn't that I set out to defy the stereotypes, but I always had a can-do attitude. And I, like my generation, and Bob Woodson and Blacks before this current generation, and I don't want to characterize everyone and put them in the same pot, but a lot of us just wanted equal opportunity. We just wanted to prove and show what we could do. We had a I'll show you attitude. And so for me, I was able to, achieve great things because of the because I don't know because of the
Mm.
circumstances. And at Princeton, I won the highest prize for my profession, the Woodrow Wilson Foundation Prize for Best Book. And there were many courses, those large psychology courses where the teachers don't know anyone's name, that I had the highest score. And
Mm.
so I had a lot of confidence in my abilities, but I started from the point where I never felt handicapped because I was Black, I'm poor, I have children. I mean, I
Right.
could go down, I'm a woman, I could go down the list. When I got to graduate school, that was when I started studying theories of oppression. And I learned that someone like me who came from a family where there were alcoholics, I was supposed to repeat the cycle.
Hmm.
And the literature says even the well adjusted children of alcoholics, when they become 40 or so, they tend to become alcoholics themselves and repeat the cycle. So that was one thing that I learned about people like me.
Right.
And it's just,
So you defied the determinism of statistics, clearly.
yes,
Now,
yes. And I think that more of us could do it. But I also believe that if I had internalized the negative messages about Black people or about my own abilities, I would not have worked as hard.
mhm,
And I can tell you that my oldest sister, a person who is extremely bright, in fact, I can never prove that this is true or not, but she told the family,
mhm.
one, that she was the prettiest girl and everyone knew that. The other thing was that she her teacher told her that her IQ was a genius level.
Okay.
No one has ever told me that that was my IQ.
Mm.
And so it may well have been the case that she was a genius level IQ, but she never, went to college. She never really applied herself in the
Right.
same way that I did. And her response was, I looked at our situation and I said, this is our lot.
Mm.
And so she didn't feel that she could, by her own ability, change things. And I'm not saying that what I did was by my own abilities,
Right.
because even though I was not, a devout Christian at the time, I just always had this I'll show you and this can do attitude. And so, personality wise, if someone told me that I couldn't do something, I was going to show them that I could.
Right. Now, your story is obviously an example of overcoming hardships. And I think that most people would recognize that personal agency and our ability to call forth the best in ourselves is ultimately our greatest asset in overcoming any of life's problems. I think my question to you is, does it necessarily follow, therefore, that the arguments that folks, particularly on the political left, will make in terms of America being systemically racist, does it follow, therefore, that those arguments are incorrect, given that what a lot of people are looking at is the functioning of systems, including the criminal justice system, looking at the phenomenon of mass incarceration, perhaps the underperformance of the school system, various other things as being obstacles that are set up for preventing Black people in general, perhaps, from having the sort of social mobility and quality of life that you and other folks have achieved facing obstacles, but your life, your path seems somewhat exceptional. And so obviously we can both go down a long story of other success stories, right? That wouldn't be hard to do. But are you saying that the idea of systemic racism is completely incorrect because there are no systemic obstacles? Are you saying that the problem with systemic racism is the idea that it is racism and maybe just not just bad policy? Or are you saying something else? What is the nature of your criticism of this idea of systemic racism?
If there is systemic racism, it has come, I would say, from the political left. Because if you look at the accomplishments that many Blacks had coming out of slavery, uh, you need only read Booker T. Washington's Up from Slavery or read about Frederick Douglass or W.E.B. Du Bois. Blacks have been able to achieve things, but I think that the character building, the fact that I had to work hard to achieve those A's. I was working full time to be able to go to school. There are things that people cannot do for you. And I believe a lot of Black children, they have teachers who believe that they can't learn and that they are inferior. And so they're not given the same kind of encouragement and attention that would cause them to work harder. And when it comes to the criminal justice system, the Black crime rate has not always been as high as it is right now. And I think that the absence of the fathers in the household, that's one factor. But the other thing is a lot of young people in the Black community and maybe the white community as well, there's no respect for authority, whether it's the teacher or the police officer or some other adult. And if you don't respect authority and you have no moral code that comes from the Judeo-Christian values and ethics, that even though I was not a regular churchgoer, I knew right from wrong. If you don't have those things, you're going to make bad decisions. And that's not about the system, that's about people's character, the decisions they make. And I believe that the America would be better off if we went back to strong civic education. As a child, I did have civic education. I believed I lived in the greatest country in the world. I still believe that. And when I look at America, I see a country that's made a lot of mistakes, but we've always tried to correct that. Excuse me. We've always tried to correct our mistakes. We've always tried to be better. And I see that as part of the American story. And whites have always assisted Blacks and tried to help overcome the impact of slavery, its past and present effects. And there were always abolitionists. And if you look at the institution of slavery, most of that was confined to the South. And it's not something that I believe should characterize America, nor can it be an excuse for the fact that so many Blacks have failed to achieve. I think we're making bad decisions and we are blaming other people when we as a group could take more responsibility. And when I think about systemic racism, I think that systemic racism are the racial lies that people are being told that prevent them from being their best selves.
And so you use the phrase racial lies. Now, part of what you said a moment ago is that if there is such a thing as systemic racism, that it comes from the political left because you have an educational system that may seem to be failing, and a welfare system that I think you would argue tends to perpetrate a sense of dependency, which may undermine the initiative necessary to accomplish the sorts of things that you've accomplished in your life. For instance, my question, though, is how is it when people are using the term systemic racism? First of all, I think folks would do with some clarity in terms of what exactly it is people mean by that. Because I think that sometimes I'm not sure when somebody uses the term whether or not they were referring to a system that is deliberately racist or a system that just happens to function in a way that disadvantages a certain group of people. I know that you've studied the arguments on different sides here. Can you help us with the definition very quickly?
Well,
What is
first
it?
of all, I would say that 90% of the people that are using the expression systemic racism have no idea what they're talking about. That
Okay.
they hear the word, it sounds great, and so it rolls off the tongue very easily. Systemic racism. Traditionally, it referred to the institutional structures of our society. And so those institutions were supposed to be racist in a way that disadvantaged racial and ethnic minorities and privileged whites. I would argue that in the 1960s, when we passed three major civil rights bills, and we actually passed four, but three major civil rights bills, we really eliminated the institutional racism that was by law. After that, the racism that existed had to do with what was in people's hearts and minds, which is slower to change. I would say that in America, the fact that we have elected a Black president, not just once, but twice, And we've had two Black attorney generals. We've had Blacks in positions of power throughout our society. That if America was this horrible country with all these barriers to Black success, you would not have so many Black successes. And I've been in situations where there were Harvard educated, middle class, affluent Blacks that would stand in front of a group of young people and tell them that America is a horrible place, it's systemically racist, and paint a picture that if I were those young people listening to these people who are very accomplished, paint this dismal picture about America and the future for people of color, I would just feel like giving up at that point. And I think the civil rights leadership, they have done a horrible disservice to young people because they're not telling young people, whether they're white or Black, or anyone, what they can do in America. They're not encouraging people to avail themselves. They are creating a fear by making it seem like it's a truth statement that if I'm a Black man or a woman, when I leave my house, I'm putting my life in danger because of racist police that will gun me down whenever they get a chance. These kinds of lies are crippling to our society. It creates a lot of resentment and it causes people to give up. And I think there could be so many more success stories. I'm not a genius. There are many people that come from disadvantaged backgrounds, white and Black, who have been able to overcome the circumstances of their birth. And a lot of it is the attitude. It's about what do you believe about the world? And I think in America, you have a country where people like successes. They want to see their fellow Americans achieve the American dream. And I think that a person's attitude is more determinative than any of the other factors as to whether or not they're going to be able to have success.
So that's part of why I wanted to ask you to talk a little bit about the people that inspired you and helped you to believe in what it is you were capable of. Precisely because I too believe very much in this idea that you really can't, as gifted as you may actually be, in terms of the talents that God and nature have given you, if you don't believe that you can make a way for yourself, it is very hard to actually do it. In other words, who can hit a target that they're not aiming for? Typically
That's
speaking,
right.
right?
And here's the thing that dismays me is that when I entered college and generations of Blacks before me, I didn't, go to a private school. I did not have the best education. I availed myself of what was available. It was very important that I started at a community college and had success there before I went to the 4-year college, before I went to the university. If I had started at the 4-year college, I probably would have been failing. And I have a personality that if I'm not doing well, then I just will stop and I'll do something else.
Right.
And so it's important for me to start at a level where I could have success and then move my way up by working hard. But I always believed that there was a correlation between the effort I put forth and what I would receive as a reward. And for me, as a woman, I had been married at 16 and divorced, and then again at 24, and found myself in situations where I was in danger, but I felt like I could not afford to leave the situation. I did not have the income to make it, to pay my rent and to be able to make it on the one income. And so it was important to me to get an education so I could get a good job and be able to live off one salary. That was a big motivation for me. And I found a lot of women are trapped in situations, or they feel like they're trapped in situations, and they need to know that there is a way out.
Right.
And it's not just unique to me, but if you have a goal and the society is not out to get you, and I believe if we stop hating and believing the worst of our fellow Americans, we could achieve a lot together.
So I definitely want to talk about the feeling of animosity that is building between the American people. And so Let's pivot to that in a second. I want to affirm the fact that the story that you tell is proof positive of the power of individual agency. The tension that I sometimes see, or I think I see at least, though, is between sort of on the one hand the desire of people when looking at politics and policy to say, okay, structures matter, policy matters, it has an impact on outcomes. But if you focus too much on that, you undermine the thing that we all need to be hearing, which is the idea that we can overcome in just the way that you have, perhaps regardless of the obstacles set in front of us, if we're able to call forth the best in ourselves. That tension, I think, can perhaps go the other way, though, sometimes, or at least I'd be curious to know if you think it can, where sometimes some of the criticisms that we'll receive as African American conservatives and Republicans and so forth is that, and just people on the right in general, that there's such a focus on the pulling ourselves up by our bootstraps that sometimes we can ignore the genuine policy, political, or structural issues that really are unfair or really are meaningfully difficult for people to get past in trying to achieve the American dream. And so you mentioned, of course, some policy critiques on the left, education, etc. But a lot of folks would argue that the Republican Party, at least as much as the Democratic Party, has been problematic in areas of criminal justice reform, that issue set. More recently, President Trump signed into law the First Step Act, which advanced some significant reforms in the criminal justice system. It had the support of many folks, politicians on the left. Pundits like Van Jones worked alongside Jared Kushner and members of the administration to make that happen. Do you think that as important as individual effort is, that there is nevertheless some significant body of policy reforms that we need to be looking at on the structural level, whether it's Democrats or Republicans, just as Americans, to help open the floodgates of opportunity? Or do you think that by and large, we can generally put policy aside and just focus on the cultural aspects that should be motivating change in the Black community? What is the balance in terms of
Well,
what's
a
important?
couple of things.
Mm-hmm.
First of all, I wouldn't say that I pulled myself up by my own bootstraps
Mm-hmm.
because, as a person of faith, I believe that God orders our footsteps,
Right.
and that even though I didn't know Him and I was struggling, I feel that He knew me and that He knows each of us.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's something that I have to acknowledge. And when it comes to policies, like affirmative action was a big deal in the 1980s and when I was going to college. And it was very easy for Blacks and people of color to get into colleges and universities, but they were held to the same standards. So many of them did not make it. I think the reaction today is to lower the standards and just dumb it down to the point that no one gets a good education. And I'm appalled by the fact that there's so many colleges and universities that are resegregating students, that they're putting Black kids by their own demands, and by Black kids, I mean young people that want to take classes with other people in their same race, that they are accommodating that. They're accommodating segregated dorms. Rutgers University made news a couple of months ago because they were relaxing the English standards of grammar for Black students. And to me, that is racism. That is going backwards. That doesn't help anyone. And when you create these politically correct environments on campuses where you cannot have an honest dialogue about issues because it might offend someone, no one gets a good education under those circumstances, where if a professor accidentally or even in the process of teaching a course says something that offends a person in a protected group, that person can have the professor written up. Maybe the professor has to apologize, or he or she, will be hounded. Or in the case of conservatives, there may be demands to take away their tenure. That is something that doesn't serve the needs of people. And I think with affirmative action, it was well intended, but I saw in my family that the poorest of the poor, and my family is like a laboratory of America. I'm the one that got out and reached college. There are several that have high school equivalencies, but we all dropped out of school after the eighth grade. We were the poorest of the poor. Affirmative action has never reached down for the poorest of the poor. And during my educational experiences, and as I see America, I've seen affluent minorities, those that come from solid middle class backgrounds, they have been the recipients of a lot of the aid that has been dispensed to help descendants of slaves. And we know that the major colleges and universities, they fill their positions mostly with immigrant blacks. They do that as part of their affirmative action, when we know that when affirmative action was first adopted, it was to help eradicate the past and present effects of slavery. It was targeted towards the descendants of slaves, but then the liberal left shifted and changed and pleaded until it became diversity, which meant that any number of factors would qualify. So it was no longer about blacks. And many of the policies that came out of the 1960s that the Democratic Party pushed have been policies that have destroyed the black communities. Policies matter, but the policies we need are ones that help people to help themselves, that helps them to get out of poverty and to have a better life. And guaranteed income or paying people to stay home, all of these things are not helping people to improve their lives. It's creating people who are disaffected and disconnected to America. And if we want our country back, we have to have equal opportunity, but we also have to have people who would take responsibility for their own actions. We're reaching a point in America now where it seems like that it's never acceptable for a police officer to arrest a black person, regardless of what they did. And if that black person being arrested doesn't peacefully go along with the police officer and get into the patrol car, if there is any kind of resistance, it seems that the police officer is supposed to let the person just walk away. That is a double standard. And I think that it's unrealistic, that we are missing something somewhere. And policies do matter, but we as Black people or people of color have to be realistic. And we have to realize that it's not about us, that in America, there are different races and ethnicities, and the focus can't always be just on Blacks. And I know that this may sound offensive to some people, but white people have rights too. They're covered by the 1964 Civil Rights Act and the Equal Protection Clause of the Constitution. And the shaming that's taken place in the name of social justice against white people because of their ancestors or because they live in middle class homes or they have two parents, that is unacceptable. If it's unacceptable to do to a person of color, it's also unacceptable to do to a person that is Caucasian.
So I happen to be reading White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo right now. Of course, Robin DiAngelo is herself a white person. And there's an interesting quote towards the start of the book where she says that it is important that white people, quote, accept that racism is unavoidable and that it is impossible to completely escape having developed problematic racial assumptions and behaviors, unquote, as white people. Sort of making the, I guess, argument that even for many white folks who think of themselves as good and tolerant people, that our history is so deeply sort of ingrained with racial prejudice that still comes out in ways that I guess animate the relationships between white people and black people in a way that can translate to some of the larger disparities that we see in society. But I want to focus on this psychological piece because it seems as if the definition of racism, depending on who's using the term at least, has shifted somewhat over time, or there's a tug of war over what it means. Now, I had my own upbringing as an African American. First of all, I'm biracial, mixed race. My father is white, my mom is black, and I grew up in a very kind of well-integrated multicultural community, Culver City, California, very diverse. I never had the sense that I did not belong or was mistreated on the basis of my skin color. But 15 miles away from me, my wife, Mrs. Wood, she grew up in the Jordan Downs projects in Watts. I guess I'll make the point that she's darker complexion than I am too, but grew up in a very different kind of surrounding, even though it's geographically not too far. She has very clear memories of, just for example, going to department stores in the South Bay, where it was a wider area and so forth, with friends of hers who were white because she went to school at Artesia, which was outside of Watts. And she remembers store managers following her around and treating her with a great deal of suspicion, seeming to think that she might be about to steal something. When, as it turned out, at least one of her white friends was actually apparently was stealing something at least one or two occasions, but didn't draw suspicion, I guess, because she was white and Triana,
Right.
my wife, was black, right? And so, it's possible that that store manager would not have looked at herself as being racist or prejudiced or
Right.
what have you, but she has a certain profile or stereotype, perhaps psychologically, that she's acting on. So my question for you
I agree
is,
with all of that. In
okay,
fact,
and so you
um,
see what I'm getting at. I mean, the question
yeah, I
is
mean,
yeah, what is a
it's
proper way of understanding racism, and is there some kernel of truth to what Robin DiAngelo is saying? How should we understand these things?
well, I think it's human nature for people to favor their own group, whether you're
Mm,
white or black, and it's human nature. And
mm,
there's a reason why you have that expression, birds of feather flock together.
mm,
And I think when a lot of white people look at black people, they may have the stereotypes in their minds that blacks are more criminal. And every stereotype has a grain of truth. And if you look at the crime statistics on violent crime and different types of crime, we know that blacks are overrepresented among victims as well as perpetrators. And so that certainly works to the disadvantage of black people. And I believe that, even for myself, I can tell you that many blacks will dress, if you're middle class, you dress a particular kind of way when you're going shopping.
mm,
That's something that just people do, and it minimizes problems. And I hear a lot of people, black, they talk about the talk. Well, I raised two sons, two black sons, and my talk with them back in the 1990s when they started driving had to do with if you get stopped by a police officer, you we are from the South. You say yes, sir, or yes, ma'am, or no, sir, or no, ma'am. But you show respect to the police officer. And if that police officer is wrong, when you get home, we'll take care of it. But I did not want them to try to challenge the police officer. I wanted them to show respect. And I expected that same respect to be shown towards teachers.
mm. Right. I wish that we had more time to go even deeper into some of this psychology and some of the other things that we have on the table here. Because, and actually, let me just go ahead and say part of the beauty of Braver Angels is that in our workshops, our live events, and of course in our podcast too, we try to start dialogues that begin with listening, right? So, right now, a number of folks are going to be listening to you who are not familiar with the work of Carol Swain, in part because they're progressives. They're what we call blues in house, right? And this is a space for folks to be able to hear from voices on each side of the aisle who they wouldn't necessarily get an opportunity to hear from otherwise, as we just typically tend to take information in from one partisan bubble or the other, right? And so this conversation on systemic racism, what does it mean, the relationship of culture, and so on and so forth. This is one that I hope that you can come back and help us take to the next level later on.
Could
And
I
what?
say one other thing?
Yes, very quick.
It has to do with the fact that I believe that racism cuts in more than one direction, and I reject the argument that we've heard that only white people can be racist.
Mm,
And I think that we would progress in America if we looked at racism as something that every group is capable of perpetrating.
indeed. Well, so having said that, then there's one question that I know that folks will be very interested in hearing your answer with respect to, because you said up top that you are a Christian and that you are a person of faith,
Yes.
right? And that's something that I would claim as well for myself. Many people have a difficult time understanding, certainly on the left, how it is that a person who prizes the biblical virtues of honesty and humility and love and compassion and a wide range of attributes that Christ exemplified, would be able to in turn support President Donald Trump politically. And indeed, President Trump has earned the support of, I think, a majority, certainly, of America's
Right.
evangelical Christians, at least, and many others. Um, what is your answer to this? What is your answer to this? To what people see as an inconsistency on the part of many Christians in America, and being willing to support a man politically who does not seem to acquit himself in their eyes in a saintly sort of fashion.
Well, first of all, I would say that those people misunderstand Christianity.
Mm-hmm.
They believe, that Christians are perfect people. Christians are very imperfect, and that's why we needed a savior. And we believe that Jesus Christ died on the cross for our past, present, and future sins. We all are imperfect, and we're not responsible for the sins of our ancestors. And with Donald Trump, he is a work in progress, just like the rest of us. And I believe that, his love for America, his love for Christianity and our Constitution, that is enough. But mostly the problem is that the people that are saying that how can Christians support Donald Trump have no idea about Christianity and the finished work on the cross.
Mm. So my great moral role model in American history, growing up, and to this day, really, is among many others, of course, Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. Doctor and Reverend, but a lot of times, I mean, we all know that he was a preacher, but sometimes I feel it is underemphasized just how important the gospel and the ethical teachings, spiritual teachings of Christ in the scriptures were in filling out the philosophy of nonviolence by which Dr. King, Reverend King, helped to advance social progress in America and ultimately just sort of the greater realization of American ideals. But part of what nonviolence teaches is that we can use love as a social tool for speaking to the conscience of the
Right.
opposition, right? And clearly, I think you look at the Gospels. Christ's love, even for those who disagree with him, or even those who were
Yes.
nailing him to the cross, is such that he would pray for people who would otherwise, quote, spitefully use him, right? And take right and take glory really in doing the work of God in that way. It says in the Beatitudes, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be children of God." And so, my question to you here is, I feel like we're living in a moment where we have such a difficult time even agreeing on the definitions of basic terms. We talked about racism, we talked about other things that people are defining differently. And I feel as if there's an erosion of any shared moral vocabulary by which
Right.
the American people and people, black, white, and other, of all categories, can go deeper than just the talking points of the Republican and Democratic parties, so to speak, in order to arrive at deeper moral truth. And it seems to me that ideally the church would be an important part, even for folks who aren't Christian, but in terms of modeling a type of love oriented sort of patriotism and approach to navigating our difficult differences that would give people sort of a moral vocabulary to hang on to and something that goes deeper than just our politics. I'm wondering if you have a vision or an understanding in terms of how the church can be a vehicle for healing and reconciliation in the way that Reverend King taught in his time. Is the church stepping up to that role in society, given how divided we are at the moment, or can the church do better?
Well, you started off talking about the language, and I believe that the church is deceived because a lot of the discussions that are taking place now are affected by the cultural Marxists. That you have Marxists that are pretty much driving the social justice narrative, which lends to situations where there's all this confusion about Black Lives Matter. Black Lives Matter, that's a truth statement. Of course, Black Lives Matter. All lives matter. but there's an organization, and then you look at the roots of that organization, and I think the church does not know what to do with the philosophies and the things that are taking place that are coming from the political left. And I believe that it's very important for church leaders to learn about critical theory and critical race theory and the Marxist agenda and this replacement of the gospel of Jesus Christ with the social gospel. And the churches now are looking to the secular world to teach them how to handle race relations when the church should be leading the way. They have the moral authority, they have the answers, they have the true answers, but many of them have lost sight of the authority and power that they could be walking in.
Hmm. So one of the this is obviously a well-known verse, but one of the things that constantly recurs to me and that I try to bring into political discourse is this idea that I should think not to remove the speck from my brother's eye until I have removed the plank from my own. And so, with respect to the church's role in bridging these divides and reclaiming that moral high ground, I think I can certainly sympathize with the idea or imagine that there are philosophies that we've touched on a bit in this conversation that are very much alien to sort of the prose of religious life, and there is perhaps this attempt to try and grapple with what it is the academy is delivering to, for instance, larger society and other places in a way that allows the church to gain a certain sort of foothold in the national conversation. But drilling into the actual spirit of what it means to be a believer, again, part of what's so amazing about your personal story, Carol, and what you've talked about here in this conversation today is that you highlight the importance of our being able to believe that we can be better in order for us to actually accomplish those greater things, to have faith, I think, in our ability to become sort of new creatures. And I hear a lot from many preachers and some Christian pundits in terms of decrying the ideological excess of the political left and other folks in terms
Right.
that I can understand. But if what the gospel teaches is legitimate, then it means that whether you're a left or right, Democrat, Republican, etc., one, we all start off as imperfect in just the way you said a
Right.
moment ago. But two, it also means that we all have the capacity to transcend those imperfections. And in the context of the scripture, of course, that comes with grace and salvation and so forth. But even in a political context, it seems to me that the church could paint a vision of what we could become that is positive, perhaps, as opposed to just trying to pick the specks out of the eyes of folks, on the left or in different places, without being able to articulate sort of what a holier sort of America actually looks like. And again, I feel like that's what Dr. King did in his time when he gave us this vision of the beloved community and the promised land. It was something good to strive for. And I'm just wondering, are we seeing that coming from the church in a way that Americans of all stripes can recognize today? Or is that something that we need to pray and hope that the church can come to deliver?
I mean, the churches have been infiltrated by people who have a social justice agenda. And I think this is a difficult period for churches in America. The church should regain its authority, but the only way they can do that is to return to first things. And first things are the Sermon on the Mount and those teachings that are timeless, upon which our values and principles were shaped. I see us still as a Judeo Christian nation that has lost its way. And our churches, a lot of our leaders, they're paying more attention to the loudest voices in their congregations, just like in America with the media, we pay attention to the loudest, most extreme voices that don't represent, the middle and the average person.
Mm.
So there's a lot that we all could do. And yes, the human experience is shaped by imperfection. And if we would all admit that we don't have the answers, that we're all works in progress, I think we would be able to advance our nation and move towards unity. Like this focus on diversity so much diversity, we need to be moving towards unity as human beings. And I think that it's going to take more work for us to get to that point. But we're in this together. We rise or fall together.
That's right. And if there are deeper things that connect us as American people and as human beings, those are the things that we want to lay our hands on and lift up, I think, because, ultimately, like you said, we do rise or fall together and we need each other. And so
We do.
that's right. And so that's what we're trying to remind people here at Braver Angels. Carol Swain, I will have to leave it there. I really do hope that you can come back and join us and maybe even meet some of our folks sometime in one or two of our live events. I will keep you up to speed. You've got a precious voice, and I'm very honored that you took the time to be with us
Thank
here
you.
today.
And it's been an honor to be on your show. And I really appreciate what you're trying to do for America. And if more people would take your lead, it's really about being the people. That's my brand, be the people. And you're showing them how.
Well, thank you so much. And for all you folks who are listening, if you're interested in getting involved with the work of Braver Angels, if you are not already, join us as a member at braverangels.org. Like, share, and subscribe to this podcast, and stick with us. We are building a house united.